right. Thanks everybody for being here. This is the 10th episode of the Bookworm, so welcome. We will be recording the session to be shared online. After today's broadcast, you will all receive an email with a link to the recording as well as resources discussed today. Let's see, we should have a quick tutorial. It seems like everybody's finding the chat function just fine, so keep chiming in there. Try to select all panelists and attendees. It makes it more, gives us a better sense of who's out there and makes us feel like we're all together. You'll notice though that the conversation goes by very quickly. So for your questions for Chris today, please put those in the Q&A section. You can ask questions there. You can give it a thumbs up to upvote the question to say that you're interested in that question as well. And then the answers can be posted with the question and you can comment on those questions, or we can click that we're going to answer them live. In addition, my colleagues Ann Bennington-Helber and Tracy Peovich will be interacting with you on chat as well, providing some links for some of the things discussed today and answering questions as they see them too. The Clements Bookworm is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library enables the discovery, learning, and teaching of American history through the collection, conservation, digitization, and availability of primary sources on paper. Now, those of you who've joined us before have heard us talk about how we came up with this program. We were talking about ways to get together and see each other during this pandemic. And we got talking about missing Clements tea time. And so the idea was that this could be an opportunity to discuss current research, current books, books that we're reading, all different topics in American history in a somewhat informal setting. So we're really excited to have you here with us today. We're going to have a conversation with author Chris Phillips. And before we do that, I'm just going to stop the poll. Maybe, there it is. Thanks so much, everybody, for participating. We thought that that would be a fun topic. So I'm ending the polling and sharing the results. And as suspected, the cell phone is indeed the primary object that people carry around, but we've been seeing a lot of other fun objects in the chat, and we appreciate you telling us about those. And of course, books and notepads are pretty high up on the list as well. So thanks. All right, let me close that. We have with us today Clements Director Paul Erickson. He started at the Clements Library in January, and we're thrilled to have him here. And Paul is going to introduce Chris.
Great. Thanks so much, Angela. And it's great to see so many friends' names popping up in the chat field. Just a note, I am not actually in the Clements Library reading room since the library is currently closed. But our reading room is a much more attractive backdrop than my basement. So that is why you are seeing that beautiful reading room behind me. It's my pleasure to introduce Chris Phillips today. Chris is professor of English at Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania, where he specializes in American and transatlantic literatures of the 18th and 19th centuries, history of the book, religion and literature, historical poetics, and digital humanities. He's the author of numerous articles on those topics, published in journals including PMLA, New England Quarterly, and Early American Literature. His first book, Epic in American Culture, Sentiment to Reconstruction, was published by Johns Hopkins Press in 2012. He is also the editor of the Cambridge Companion to the Literature of the American Renaissance, which came out in 2018. He holds a PhD in English from Stanford University and has been awarded fellowships at numerous research libraries around the country, including the American Antiquarian Society, the Library Company of Philadelphia, as well as a Frederick Burkhardt Fellowship from the American Council of Learned Societies, which is one of the most competitive fellowships in all of the humanities, so a huge achievement. And I am so happy to have him with us today to talk about his most recent book, which I will hold up, and you can sort of see. It's called The Hymnal, A Reading History, and was published by Johns Hopkins in 2018. Chris, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Paul, and thanks for that introduction.
Oh, it's great to see you. So, what led you to write this book? We're the Clements is a library, and we love stories that involve discovering things in libraries or archives. So, what was the moment that led you to realize that this was a book you wanted to write?
So the beginning of this was actually even before my dissertation. I was in my first TA job in grad school, and I was getting ready to lead a discussion section on Jonathan Edwards, who is famous for scaring the bejeebers out of congregants with Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, but also is the author of what I think is a much better sermon, A Divine and Supernatural Light, which is kind of the affective, we might even think of the phenomenological experience of the joy of faith might feel like. And so I thought, there are a lot of hymns from Edwards's time that express this. I should find one of these so that I could show students where he's getting some of his language to talk about this affective dimension. And I start looking through what's available in the Special Collections Library, which I recently become enamored of at Stanford, and started looking through these early 19th century, late 18th century collections of hymns. And one of the things that kept coming up was subtitles that went something like, for the use of religious assemblies and private Christians. And I started to get really curious, how do you make a book for both? Because as someone who studies American literature and especially American poetry, certainly looking at books for private use is expected. And then I could imagine how you would do a book for public use, but how do you make one for public and private? And that question just kind of stayed in the back of my mind for years, working on other projects, getting to other things. And by the time I was wrapping up my my first book and thinking about what was going to come after it, I'd gotten really excited about book history by that point and wanted to do a book history project. And I thought, well, that public and private question with the hymns would be a really interesting book history question to explore. And I hadn't seen anybody really talking much about that. And so that was the kind of initial impulse for that. And then I had the good fortune of taking a book history seminar at the AAS back in 2009, where Lisa Gittleman and Meredith McGill were co-teaching one on book history and media history. And that really opened up, oh, wow, the hymnal, or the hymn book, as we'll start talking about in a few minutes, what the difference is between those. This is really a media story. And it can go in so many different directions, connecting with scholarship that's talking about newspapers and telegraphs and, in addition to musicology, in addition to church history, in addition to poetry. And so that really was the moment where I thought, yeah, this book needs to get written.
Great. So many great things came out of that seminar that Meredith and Lisa led. So as you mentioned, your book turns on the distinction between a hymn book and a hymnal, and it's quite pointedly mostly about hymn books, even though the book is titled The Hymnal. So for members of our audience who aren't familiar with the two distinct forms, could you talk a little bit about what the difference is between a hymn book and a hymnal, and when does the thing that we think of now as a hymnal come into being?
Yeah, and for this, actually, Angela, would it be okay if I got on the main screen here to do a little bit of show and tell? Because I think it's something that's a lot easier visually than it is to really describe. So this is a recent hymnal from the PCUSA denomination, Presbyterian Church in the USA, and this is what it looks like inside. And for anyone who's seen a hymnal in the last, say, 50 years, that's probably pretty expected. what that looks like. You have staff music, you have words going in between the lines of the staff music, and that's what a hymnal is. If you go back to, say, pre-18, really 1870, most books, the dimensions of this book are not all that different. This is a book called Christian Psalmody that was put together by Lowell Mason in the 1830s. This is what you would have to work with. So you get the text, you have information like these little M abbreviations are meter, and so that's what tells the church music director or the choir what tunes might match that. Okay, this one's long meter, so match that with a long meter tune, or CM for common meter, that's a common meter tune. And what often happened was the hymn would be read from the pulpit, partly so that everybody gets the words in their heads, but also to give the choir time to flip, because they don't necessarily know what songs they're doing ahead of time, so they can have a tune ready to go. But so that was what most people used in church for basically from the early 18th century, as various churches started using hymns, all the way up to the very late 19th century. And the slide that Angela was getting ready to show is actually the book that's considered the kind of the great hinge piece in that history, the Plymouth Collection of Hymns and Tunes, which was put together by Henry Ward Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother, and at this point a big celebrity pastor in Brooklyn. He really wanted his congregation to get better at congregational singing, and thought instead of just having the choir have the music, why shouldn't the whole congregation have the music? And he ran into a whole bunch of reasons that people gave him why that hadn't been done before, but he managed to get this book out in 1855. And I think the next slide shows a bit of what that initial formatting looked like. So again, you have the staff music showing up, and the first verse gets interlined, but then all the text is given underneath, again, because that's what people expected to see in their collections of hymns. And a lot of people actually didn't even like these books because they didn't like any of the text getting broken up by the music. This is why, even though this starts coming out in 1855, it basically takes until just about the 1880s for a lot of churches to make the switch from words only hymn books to music included hymnals.
Great. So it's appropriate for a work of book history that your book is physically a pleasure to read. It's a wonderful size, and it's a beautiful artifact. So that I appreciated that very much about it. And your book is filled with wonderful stories of specific copies of physical books and the marks that they bear of how their owners interacted with them over time. And you probably would not have used that same approach in writing your first book about the epic. So what is it about hymn books as physical things that lends itself to this deeper level of personal interaction with the book as a physical artifact?
That's a great question. So one of the very basic things that makes hymn books so important is that they have this ritual communal function. You use them in church, you use them in worship services, prayer meetings, all kinds of different things. But again, up until the very late 19th century, most churches would adopt these books the way that professors adopt textbooks. This is what we're using in Go Get One. So people would own their own books. And so the next few slides are giving some ways that people really made their books their own. This particular one, again, the owner had put a really nice cover on it, but inside the back cover had glued an envelope because he wanted to be able to carry around these notes and news clippings with him, and all, so that it became almost a kind of a travel folder for him, because he expected to have this every time he was around church, but also at home when he was having personal devotions, maybe family devotions. And so because these books were in use in multiple places and had to move pretty easily from one place to another, they became natural places to gather things, as in this particular section. They also became really great spaces to share messages with each other. And the next slide gives an example of this. It's probably not too legible from here. This is a book owned by Henry Onderdonk, who was an important local historian in Long Island in the 1830s, 1840s. And he's sitting with his daughter in church, and he writes in the flyleaf, "What are you laughing at?" And his daughter writes underneath, "Bumblebee has struck an attitude," which is apparently some sort of inside joke to them. But this is where, you know, you're sitting in church and you're not supposed to talk. It's not good manners to do that. And so you can use these flyleaves to kind of share notes and have conversations with each other back and forth. But something that's maybe a little more sanctioned that you could do with these books also is people would record family history. They would record church history, birth and death dates, marriages. A lot of these books would be given for special occasions in someone's life. And this particular one was owned by a minister who was at his grandfather's funeral. And in the back, there are several funeral hymns, and this is one of them. And this particular one was used for this service. And he writes a note, again, this won't show up super well, but just below or right next to the first stanza is recording, "This was sung at grandfather's funeral." And then the note at stanza 3 says, "Broke down here," to remember that, you know, this was the really tearjerker moment in the funeral service for him. And so these books could serve as mementos in that way, because they happen to be with people in these important church moments, important home moments. There are also uses for them in schools and so forth. But yeah, it certainly compared to, say, epic poetry, which you would read in the home, probably read in school, but the books wouldn't necessarily go around with you all that much. These books were companions for so many hours in so many different contexts that they just became kind of collectors for the marks of people's lives.
When does the tradition of having pew copies of hymnals that start, so that it became less common for people to bring their own copies back and forth to church?
That again was very much 1880s, 1890s, and a lot of what drove that was as people switched from hymn books to hymnals. Mm-hmm. This is again part of what Beecher ran into. A hymnal with music in it is a lot more expensive. Mm-hmm. It's not just expensive, but there was a review of a hymnal in the 1870s where the reviewer said, well, one of the good things about this hymnal is that it's smaller than average, because it now takes the strength of a grown man to hold a hymnal for the length of a sung hymn. Mm-hmm. And so it just got to the point, again, with things like this modern book. It's heavy.
Yep.
It's pretty pricey. You aren't going to want to schlep it back and forth, and not everybody is going to want to buy their own. You know, if you're in, say, a Methodist church in the 1850s, you can pick up one of these things for pretty cheap. You can carry it really easily. This is, again, a words only book. But once you have the music in there, the economics changes, the ergonomics are really different at that point. And so, you know, the hymnal just won't live with people in the same way that a hymn book can.
Yeah. And also clothing changes. I mean, pockets get smaller,
Mm-hmm.
and it's harder to fit a book in a jacket pocket. So hymn books are kind of unique in that they're books that are defined more by their paratexts than their texts. Mm-hmm. And by that, I mean things that are not the text itself. So hymn books and hymnals are things that have a first line index, which is not something that other books have, and they have a meter index typically. And your book narrates a long story of back and forth about the value of different paratextual options in these books. So what made a hymn book a good hymn book in the 19th century? What made it one that succeeded in the market and that people wanted to have?
Yeah, so again, the first line index was pretty much non-negotiable. That was, if your book didn't have that, it just was not going to go anywhere. But there are a couple of examples. Presbyterians in particular in the 1820s and 1830s, as they were trying to figure out what their denomination's book was going to look like, the first take on that was to just mix up a bunch of texts and then have a subject index and a first line index in the back, and people hated that. So one of the things that came out of that was you really need organized sections. So you need all the Easter hymns to go together. You need all the Thanksgiving hymns to go together. You need all the funeral hymns, hymns on the Trinity, so on and so forth. All these things need their own proper space, as well as then being indexed in the hymnal. And I think as time went on, there also was more push for identifying authors. And usually you wouldn't find a separate author index. That's a really 20th century thing. But what you would find is author names starting to get added on, say, the first line index or something like that, because people would want to know, say, if you're Methodist, which of these are bona fide Charles Wesley hymns, or if you're trying to figure out, okay, I really like Anne Steele's poetry, or I really like Watts, or I really like, some of the new writers like Reginald Heber in the 20s and 30s. How can I find them? Mm-hmm. And so those first line indexes are not 100% convenient at that point, but are definitely becoming more of a sales point. The other funny thing that starts to come up is, particularly before the denomination books get big in the 1820s and after, there are a couple of people, and Jedediah Morse is one of these, who tries to market a book that has cross-referenced numbering. So that, you've got this edition of Watts and that edition of Watts and this other edition of Watts. And so if you say, okay, we're singing Watts in our church, but people have 4 different books and the numbering works 4 different ways, the preacher stands up and says, we're singing number 619, and everybody's got something different. And so these cross-reference books that tried to catch what the major, the most popular numbering systems were, and to say, okay, when you're at 619, the person with this other book will be at 438, and so on and so forth. That was another kind of not just organizational, but marketing technique that people use. Like, hey, you don't have to force everyone in your congregation to buy the exact same book if you have these kinds of cheat sheets that you can use.
So does when the anthology appears in the 1830s, especially the 1840s, as a collection of multi-authored works, whether of prose or poetry, is the organization of the anthology informed by the hymn book, or does the anthology inform the way that hymn books come to be organized? What's the interaction there?
That's a great question. So generally, anthologies have a lot more influence on hymn books than the other way around. Yeah. And where this tends to show up in the wake of those anthologies and the gift books that start to become big business in the mid 19th century, you have what I call private hymn books, which are designed really for home use. And some of these are little tiny devotional books. Like, this is a book the American Tract Society made that's called Family Hymns, and it's specifically for family devotionals. Then you get other books that really are kind of poetry books, but all the poetry happens to be hymns. And that's something that Anna Warner, rather, the sister of Susan Warner, who wrote The Wide, Wide World, gets really involved in editing those books. A number of other women, especially, are real leaders in putting those kinds of books together. And people like Emily Dickinson and her sister-in-law Susan were actually fans of this kind of book. And those books tend to look much more, they're either author-based, or they have these really broad topics, like, life, love, these kinds of things that that they'll be organized by. And so in that way, the kind of organization of a hymn book had tended to follow the needs of a church, and anthologies were much more about entertainment and sometimes about education. And that's where the private hymn book, starts to go more that way, where people are not necessarily looking for every stage in the catechism that they want to be able to find in their home books. What they want to be able to find is some inspirational stuff, or they want to be able to find, things about nature, or, something along those lines.
So you've mentioned him a couple times, and if there's a hero in your book, or at least an omnipresent force, it's Isaac Watts, who is absolutely everywhere in the religious and print cultures of both the UK and America in the 18th and 19th centuries. So for members of our audience who may only know Isaac Watts as the guy who wrote Joy to the World or When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, talk a bit about the scope of his cultural impact.
Yeah, so Watts is one of these people who he was alive at exactly the right time, and he made all kinds of, took all kinds of advantage of that. He was born the year that Milton died, and he lived to see the real surge of what we think of now as the Great Awakening. So he's of that, the Puritans are on their way out. Something else is happening in the history of Protestantism in the English-speaking world. And as he, as a young clergyman, starts to get involved in church life, one of the things he's really concerned about is education. So he puts together one of the very first reading textbooks, for instance, in the English language, where he saw there was tons put together for the boys in grammar school, but not for girls, not for the poor, people who only would need to know English. And so he started to put together these really basic textbooks that were going across dozens of editions. He had a logic textbook that was the standard. It was being used at Harvard and Yale in the early years, or in the 18th century. Yeah, he was a popularizer of science. He was an early advocate of children's literature, and actually probably one of the biggest places outside of hymnody that his influence is really traceable today is in his divine songs that he wrote for children. And these actually came out less than 10 years after his hymn collection that included things like When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. Interestingly, it was before Joy to the World, because that was part of his Psalms project, which came out later than that. But just to give you a little bit of an idea, this is one example, mid-19th century example of these divine songs in a little toy book for kids. But you could find Watts packaged in so many different ways. You also got this kind of thing, much, much bigger book with much higher production values, including some really nice steel engravings. And this particular book was designed as a Christmas gift book for parents and relatives to give young children. That particular one was a 5th birthday present from an uncle to a niece. So Watts went all over the place with these, and it seemed every kid in the English-speaking world knew these things, to the point that in Alice in Wonderland, when Alice is starting to get a sense, hey, I don't really know who I am anymore, she tries to recite "How doth the little busy bee," which is from that Watts collection. And it comes at "How doth the little crocodile," and she gets all mixed up and she gets all upset. Then later on, when she meets the griffin and the mock turtle, they at one point say, hey, recite something for us. She tries to recite "'Tis the voice of the sluggard," another text from that collection, and it comes out "'Tis the voice of the lobster." And the griffin, his response to that is, "That's not the way they did it when I was in school," which was this marvelous joke in the 1860s that we don't get now, which is that, this stuff went so far all over the place that even monsters in Wonderland grew up learning these texts in school. So Watts really was the guy you learned to read from. He was the guy you kept reading throughout your life. And again, you might be buried with a Watts hymn on people's lips. He really dominated not just church life, but school life, children's reading lives. Yeah, he was, and one other mark just to quickly mention, what is often thought of as the quintessential contemporary history of the Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards' faithful narrative of the surprising work of God. He wrote as a letter to Benjamin Coleman, who was a Boston minister. Coleman was a correspondent of Watts's, sent the letter over to Watts. Watts saw it into print and actually may have even come up with the title. Okay. So the very first time that Edwards, as a historian of his moment, kind of emerges on the world stage, it's because of Isaac Watts.
Wow, that's a great connection. So your book shows really wonderfully how closely certain hymns were associated with particular Protestant denominations and were seen as belonging to specific groups, and that makes sense with, Charles Wesley hymns were thought of as Methodist hymns. But there are also some fascinating stories in your book of cross-denominational borrowing of hymns. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a bit about some of those stories and whether there were any denominational barriers that were just too high for a hymn to make it across. And just from my own experience, I remember a very surprising moment sitting in my in-laws Catholic church and seeing "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God" on the bulletin, and I was like,
Yep.
"This hymn is not about what you think it's."
Yeah, and one of the things that is fascinating about hymns to me, and one of the things I really loved getting into as I got into this project, is hymns certainly can be that kind of identity marker. Oh, that's a Catholic text, that's a Lutheran text, that's a Baptist text, so on and so forth. But more often than not, they actually traveled surprisingly well. And one of the reasons they could travel well is because you could rewrite hymns. Intellectual property was very, very loose with these things for a long time. And so if you had, for instance, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, the Trinity hymn that Reginald Hebert wrote, which is considered one of the most popular hymns today. Almost nobody knew it before the 1860s because it didn't have that awesome tune to go with it before that point. There were plenty of other Trinity hymns that didn't have as funky a meter as what Hebert wrote that one in. But once it did get big, everybody wanted to use it, including Unitarians. But by default, by definition, Unitarians are not going to want to sing about the Trinity. So it turns out that if you just take 2 lines where Trinity is actually mentioned and revise those, it just becomes a hymn about the transcendence of God. And so, those kinds of things happen with amazing ease across the history. Even thinking about, very early Latter-day Saints hymnals are absolutely fascinating because everybody's coming from somewhere else. So the people who had been Methodists are bringing their stuff. The people who had been Baptists are bringing their stuff. And Joy to the World was one of the texts that makes it into the very first collection that comes out in, I think, 1831. And, but it says, Joy to the World, the Lord will come. So it's rewritten as a hymn of prophecy rather than one of celebrating that God has already arrived in the world. And again, that's just following the tradition where, as far as Watts was concerned, he was just redoing Psalm 98. And only later on did people say, this would be really great for Christmas. Mm-hmm. And so again, these just keep changing their uses, their context, their nuances over a long period of time. And probably the one that was the toughest for people to get into, at least initially, thinking about that kind of limit case that you mentioned, is Jesus, Lover of My Soul by Charles Wesley, which again is a beloved hymn today. Jesus, lover of my soul, let me to thy bosom fly. But there is this real discomfort with singing the word bosom in mixed company in the 19th century. So that you have churches that are adopting it. Certainly the Methodists will just go like, yeah, Methodist, like sensuality is what we do in hymnody. Let's just kind of keep this going. And Baptists had to rewrite, to figure out how to get bosom out of there. It gets written out of, say, the Rugby Chapel hymnal in England. The sons of the richest, mightiest families in the realm are going to Rugby, and damned if our children are going to sing the word bosom in their chapel service. So that gets written out there, and at the same time, Catholics love it, and just very, very quickly adopt it because, again, the way it handles the body, the way it handles sensuality, this kind of erotic overtones of the relationship with the Savior aren't a problem for them. Similarly with Moravians, who is where actually the Wesleys got a lot of their kind of their inspiration for the sensibility that goes into Charles's hymnody comes from Moravian, my dearest Jesu, and these kinds of texts.
Right, and your book has a wonderful story about the introduction of hymnody into Reformed Judaism that is will probably be surprising to a lot of members of our audience. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So one of the really the things that really surprised me starting to get into this project was coming across this book that it was a local collection put together in the 1840s for one congregation, but it was a synagogue congregation in Charleston, South Carolina. And again, this particular group was the first congregation to switch to reform in terms of their allegiance, their sensibility in the U.S. They were not the first established as a reform congregation, but they kind of led that turn. And one of the things that they sought to do with these hymn books was to show other people who are interested in doing reform in a Jewish context what that hymnody might look like. The people who led this got really interested in what their business partners in, say, Episcopal churches, Unitarian churches, Lutheran churches were up to in, say, the 1820s, 1830s. And a lot of these men, as young professionals, tried to break away from their congregation. They formed their own kind of society for about a year, and then it fizzled and they came back. Eventually, once they were more senior, they were able to help sway the board to go reform. But during that year they were away, they were experimenting with Protestant hymns that took up Old Testament or Hebrew Bible texts. And so by the time they launched their own kind of reform liturgy, for one thing, the biggest controversy was not the hymns. The biggest controversy was they wanted an organ installed in the synagogue, and that was not done in Jewish liturgy at that particular point. And so half the congregation left to form what we might think of now as a conservative congregation. They eventually remerged after about 25 years, but they wound up writing their own hymnody, but it was based on what they had seen from people like Watts, but also from people like Henry Muhlenberg, who was an Episcopal hymnodist that they were really taken with. These younger men were in the 1820s. Right. And so, about 80% of that initial book was actually written by one woman who was the daughter of one of these men, Penina Moise, who was in charge of the Sabbath school program there and was already an established magazine poet at this point and was getting published in places like Gaudy's and Graham's. And, she was, part of that kind of, if you want to think of it, poetess mainstream of that time, the women who wrote about love and loss and family and nature. And she turned those skills to adapting Old Testament texts or get Hebrew Bible texts. And that was what a lot of Reformed congregations used for the next 20, 30 years.
I have a lot more questions. This, as you know, this is a project I absolutely love and love talking about. But I see we have a lot of questions in the Q&A, so I'm just going to ask one last question. So in the experience of writing every book, there's always a story or a figure, or in this case, a physical book that you really wanted to get into your book that for some reason wound up on the cutting room floor. So what's the story that you really, really loved that didn't make it in?
Well, fortunately, it turns out that story connects with the Clements Library. And so this is a perfect chance for me to get to talk about this. So again, my project is a project about reading. It's about reception, what people did with these things. And I include, editors as readers, even thinking of authors a bit as readers. But I really didn't have a huge amount of space to talk about authorship. And there was this one text I got really, really interested in, because as I was working on figuring out what, say, African Methodists were doing in their congregations during the early 19th century, a figure who looms very large in that world is Richard Allen, essentially the founding father of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the largest of the African Methodist denominations. And he also put together the first two hymn collections for use specifically in an African American congregation. There are a couple of those texts that have been identified as written by him. There's one that didn't go in the books, but has been attributed to him. And this image that Angela has brought up on the screen, Spiritual Song, Allen is identified as the publisher at the bottom. And it said you can go to his house on Spruce Street in Philadelphia and buy it. And this was a very common thing to be done with hymns. They weren't just in book form, but a lot of them would be produced in handbills, broadsides, these single sheets that could get handed out, say at special occasions, or hey, here's a popular song right now. It came out as a revival. Lots of people like it. We can't put it in a book yet. It'll be out in a few months. In the meantime, here's a broadside. This is part of that particular corner of print culture. Every scholar of African-American Christianity who's written about this has attributed this text to Allen as the author. Every white historian of what's known as the Sacred Harp tradition, which is a kind of singing tradition that's associated with, say, the Ohio Valley, the Carolinas, you know, these west and south regions of the country, use this text in that tradition, and these historians have identified a white Methodist in Kentucky as the author for this. And so I started to get really, really interested. Okay, why are these two groups not just giving different answers, but completely ignoring the other? Like, nobody ever says these other guys are wrong. They just make their claims. And so I wanted to figure, you know, what's going on? Is Richard Allen really the source of this? And it's a weird text to begin with. It starts out, "Good morning, brother pilgrim, what marching to Zion." The whole thing's set up as a dialogue about a guy who's been at a revival, and he's not super happy with how the revival went. And this other Christian is trying to explain to him, hey, like, don't give up on your faith just because the revival wasn't good. There are other ways that God speaks to you. Right. And so it's very didactic. It's a very kind of dramatic piece that almost asks for at least two speakers. And this particular broadside only exists in one single copy, and it happens to be at the Clements. And as I started working with this, I had ordered a scan from the Clements fairly early in this process, because I was curious about this thing. And then as I came back to it, it was at one of the stages when I was at the AAS, and I started going through what they had in terms of broadsides, trying to date this thing, because I knew what dates we had for the white Methodist theory of the source of this, but how to figure out when this broadside was from, because there's no date on it. So I start looking at things like the typeface. The border ornament was actually one of the really big clues, trying to figure out who had that kind of border ornament, this kind of holly bush kind of thing going around the side, and when was that used in what locations. And eventually I got to a point where I thought, you know, I really want to know more about this thing. I want to know what's on the other side. I want to know what kind of paper this is, all these kinds of things, which I couldn't do in Massachusetts. And I didn't have a really great way of getting to Michigan at that particular point. And I was talking with Ashley Cataldo, one of the, now the manuscript curator, at that point, the associate manuscript curator at the AAS. And she's really good friends with Emmy Hastings, the books curator at the Clements. And so she said, well, let's talk with Emmy and see what she can do for us. And so Emmy graciously took a lot of questions that I had, answered them in detail, sent back pictures. And with all the different pieces coming together, I eventually did manage to determine that this broadside, even though I couldn't put an exact year on it, I got the range tight enough that I could say, yes, this predates what the white guy in Kentucky was producing. And there's a whole lot of technical stuff that goes into how I established that, and, you know, things about the text, the typeface, the paper, so on and so forth. And it just couldn't go into a story about reading. And so I'm actually working this summer on trying to finish up an article that lays all this out as really a story about not just the conditions of African-American authorship at this point and how important it was for Black Christians to write hymns, but why is it so hard to establish that they actually did write their own stuff? Mm-hmm. And so that's a story that I think is really, really crucial to all of this, but again, didn't fit into what the book was trying to convey.
Yeah, and it's also a great illustration of how no book is written out of a single library or a single archive, and that any scholar who's working in this area really needs to draw on things from multiple places.
Absolutely, and multiple staffs, I would say as well. It's a combination of the collections, but also, if I didn't have people like Ashley and Emmy to guide me and, just help make the connections. I'd still be sitting there scratching my head over what the other side of this broadside looks like.
Right. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A. So Angela, do you want to open that up and start going through some of those?
Yes, so thank you so much. This is so fascinating. Thanks, Chris. I am going to do just a couple of housekeeping slides before we go into the Q&A, but Chris has been very gracious and said that he'll answer lots and lots of questions. I just want to remind everyone, I saw a lot of discussion in the chat. In case you asked a question in the chat, if you could be so kind as to go put it in the Q&A section, that would be really helpful. I was trying to take notes, but I couldn't really listen to Chris and take notes from the chat at the same time. So with that note, I'll mention that next week, June 5th, we have Joan Knertzer talking about her miniature books, which is going to be really a lot of fun. And so join us next week. I just want to remind everybody that once you sign up for the Bookworm, you are signed up for the series, so you don't have to sign up again. You'll get a reminder next week. If you can't watch it live, you'll still get the email with the recording and the resources. If for some reason you decide you don't want to continue with our episodes, just unsubscribe. Please don't mark us as spam. It's very hard for nonprofits when you mark us as spam, because then the people who did sign up stop getting our materials. So we understand that, things change and you might not want to continue, and that is fine, but please don't mark us as spam. As many of you know, we talked earlier in the month about the possibility of having some Bookworm apparel. So Chris Ridgway, who's on staff, the digitization staff, came up with this fun design. And so we'll share a link with you if you'd like to order any apparel. The orders are available. You can order until June 7th, and then the orders will ship out from Underground Printing on June 22nd. And your order helps support the Clements Library. So if you enjoy this series and like our shirt, please buy one. All right, so then I want to tell you a little bit more about what we have planned coming up. As you know, we began the Bookworm to stay in touch with everybody, and then your participation and enthusiasm has overwhelmed us, and we're continuing through the summer. I know some of you indicated an interest in sponsoring an episode of the Bookworm, and we really thank you for that, and I'll be reaching out soon with more information, and wanted to let you know that we do have our topics planned for a while. So as I mentioned, Joan will be talking about books on the 5th. We return to our panelist format on the 12th, talking about Civil War books. On the 19th, we'll be discussing the Revolutionary War. And then on the 26th, a fellow spotlight with Scott Hierman. July 3rd, there will be no Bookworm because it's a holiday, and then we'll resume weekly after that. So I want to mention that if you're interested in supporting the Clements financially, we'll also provide a link for that. So thank you so much, everybody. Oh, I forgot to launch the poll, and I'm going to launch a poll in just a second. So let's see. All right, there. I'm launching a poll just to get some feedback about today's session. So I'll stop the share and we can see what's in the Q&A. Lots and lots of good questions.
There are a lot of good questions in here.
Good. All right. So people have been using the thumbs up to help upvote, which reorders the queue. So thank you, people, for doing that. So our first question is, can you talk about your sources about gauging people's reactions to the changes in hymnals. Very interested in the comment about how people didn't like the shift to include music. How were people discussing this?
That's a really good question. And there are a couple of ways to get at this. The more direct one, which still has, there's a certain amount of professional distancing that goes into this, is there are a lot of reviews written of these things that show up in denominational magazines in particular. Sometimes you'll find them in other literary magazines as well, depending on, if the editor is someone in the literary world, that might get some attention in that direction. What often winds up coming out with those is that these reviewers will do very, very detailed comparison to, okay, here's what's different from the last edition. Here are things that were dropped. Here are things that were added. Here are things that were changed. And then they'll offer evaluations of that. So that gives one set, but again, that's kind of like the movie reviewer who doesn't necessarily tell you what moviegoers are really thinking about this. And so the other place to go for this, and unfortunately a lot of specific numbers aren't there in terms of sales, but figuring out what books are going through a bunch of editions and at what points. And one of the reasons why I feel confident saying that people didn't initially like the hymnals was that for the Plymouth collection, as well as for the other kind of big, there were three big pioneering hymnals that brought the music onto the page with the words. Plymouth collection was one. The Sabbath Hymn and Tune Book, was sometimes called the Andover collection, was another one. Lowell Mason was in charge of the music. A couple of ministers were in charge of the text. And then Hymns Ancient and Modern was the big book put together by Henry Monk and some associates in England. And that became the Church of England's first ever hymnal. By the way, so to give you an idea how long it takes for hymns to catch on, that book comes out in 1860. It takes 2 more years for it to be adopted. It's not until 1870, because you need an act of parliament for it to become the official book. It's not until 1870 the Church of England actually has a hymnal of any sort. So one of the ways that you find this, those three all came out in 2 different versions. One was the hymn and tunes version. The other one was the hymns version, where you only have the words to the hymns. You don't have the music showing up at all. And those sold quite well. In fact, I've seen one copy of the words only book of the Plymouth collection that had the signature and the pew number of someone in Beecher's own congregation. So, Beecher's trying to get people singing, and there's at least one person who's like, nope, or maybe I'm going to sing, but I'm not going to mess around with the music. Another place where I found this was Emily Dickinson's family had a bunch of church hymn books, as well as these books for home that I mentioned earlier. And those are pretty much all still intact, or at least a lot of them are still intact, between Harvard and Brown and the Dickinson Museum. And their church First Church Amherst adopted the Sabbath Hymn and Tune Book. And all the copies that the Dickinsons own, and they own several, they basically had a set for home and a set for church, so they didn't have to schlep them. Those are all words only. So again, they had the option to use the tunes. The pastor wanted everybody to use the tunes, but people kept buying the other. And so that's not so much the smoking gun of somebody saying the words, I don't like the music, but you see people kind of voting with their pocketbook and say, I'm going to buy the book that doesn't have the music in it because that's just what I want. So that, and again, that kind of offering 2 different versions lasts for close to 20 years before publishers finally start saying, no, we're only going to do it one way.
Interesting. Thank you. So at the top of the list now is the hymnal dead, a museum piece, a subject for antiquarians, or does it have a future? And I see in the comments a reference to an article by Karen Westerfield Tucker.
Yeah, the hymns become dinosaurs. And there was a piece sometime in the last year in Christianity Today with the great headline, Come Christian Swipe to Sing, talking about apps starting to replace hymnal. And that, the big thing that a lot of people think of is that, the screens being used to project words in church have really replaced hymnals. So in some ways, I think, is the hymnal dead? I would say no, but it's changing its use. And this is actually something I've been talking about with a few different people, particularly during the quarantine. Because one of the things that was, I think, really powerful about this earlier moment of people owning these small books, carrying them back and forth, using them in church and the home, was that hymns became one of your main means of connecting what's going on in your day-to-day life with what's going on in your church, so that you're not just leaving it on Sunday. If you really liked the hymn that you sang on Sunday, you can just keep flipping back to that during the week for your devotionals, or maybe the family sings it because they like the tune, or something along those lines. And so in that way, I think there's a really powerful connection that you can make. Even when you're not in the physical space of the church, you can still stay plugged into your church through this sharing of hymns. And so you have to share text. You have to have some sort of media really in order to do that. And electronic media is certainly a great way to do that kind of thing now. But one of the things I've talked with a few people about is a lot of churches that have kind of junked their hymnals haven't actually gotten rid of them. They're sitting in a basement somewhere or in a closet or something like that. And during this time of quarantine, or at least there's a lot of discussion right now of, can you actually bring singing back into churches right now? Because that seems like one of the most germ-friendly things to do right now, is to sing in a space with somebody else. So that seems like it might be really risky. It could be that taking those old hymnals and sharing them out, taking them to people's houses, might be one way of kind of finding a new use for hymnals at this point. Again, hymnals have been used for all kinds of things over the years, both in that small hymn book form and in the later kind of form. And so I tend to think that we actually might be in a place where we have an opportunity to reuse and as well as rethink some of those things. That, certainly apps, being able to Google text, listen to recordings online, all that kind of thing is great. But there's also, for a lot of people, there's something about holding the book in your hand. It's kind of like, it's like the paper versus Kindle argument that, they only want their novels in paper because there's just something about holding that. And I think for some people with, not just their Bible, but with hymns, that also could be something you can make it more tactile by taking those old junky hymnals and giving them another life, essentially, but a life in homes rather than a life in a sanctuary.
Interesting. Thank you. All right. DJ says, I am writing my dissertation in church music and hymnody. I am from a unique denominational tribe where singing has been especially important in our history, Churches of Christ, of which many are still a cappella. One of my main contentions is how the hymnal has served as a creed in meter. What places might you offer from your research as to how the hymnal as familial, social, ephemeral, historiographical also forms what people believe outside of or in addition to religious church worship use?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And yeah, I'm really glad that you're working on this topic. There's so much to be done, and coming out of a rich tradition, rich singing tradition, like the Churches of Christ is great. That's one, I wish I knew more about the print culture of the Churches of Christ. And that's, I'm continuing to work on hymns. That this actually gives me an idea for something that I want to dip a bit more into. But yeah, the creed and meter idea is really, really interesting. And I'm sure that DJ is familiar with John Wesley's statement that he makes when he puts the first big Methodist denominational book together in 1780. He says that the hymn book is a book of practical divinity for ordinary Christians. And that idea of practical divinity is in terms of this is your faith as you actually live it. So there's, the faith and the theology books, there's what you read in the Bible, then there, what's actually happening in your day-to-day life. And his argument was that the hymn book, as it draws on the Bible, as it draws on the creeds, all these kinds of things, is actually where the rubber meets the road in the most powerful way. So yeah, this is a really, really interesting topic to get into. And in terms of what I've found that kind of speaks to that, there are certain churches that really, really took that to heart. That I think could be great case studies for this. One big one is the Dutch Reformed Church in the US. Really interesting factoid. The very first time that Amazing Grace is put into a hymnal outside of the book that John Newton himself produces in the 1770s is in the 1789 US Dutch Reformed book. And the reason they include it, they have, going back to the organization, they have a big section of their hymn book is just hymns that illustrate these different pieces of the Heidelberg Catechism, line by line, going through the whole thing. And Amazing Grace is put in there as one of the Heidelberg Catechism kind of proof texts, or more of a mnemonic text, actually, rather than a proof text, to say, here's a way to remember what this point in the Heidelberg Catechism is supposed to be telling you about grace, about salvation, so on and so forth. So I think the Dutch Reformed are a great tradition to look at along those lines, where they really are thinking about what's the theological import of what's going on here. And then on the flip side of it, the private hymn books tend to really de-emphasize doctrine and go much more toward religious experience. One of my favorites in that group is one that Anna Warner did called Hymns of the Church Militant. And one of her big pushes is, hey, you can learn from all denominations because all denominations have experienced Christian life. You may not agree with doctrine, you may not agree with worship practices, all these things, but people have had God working in their lives. And so she is trying to find all these hymns that she sees as testimony to God working in people's lives. And she'll happily pull from Catholics and Methodists and Episcopalians, Presbyterians, so on and so forth. But for her, it's not to express the theology, it's to express the spirituality of Christianity that becomes important to her. So I think of those as two, working in different directions, two really interesting examples of, I think, some of what you're trying to get at, like who's really embracing the creed and meter and who's, aware of it, but setting it aside for other purposes.
Great, thank you. Let's see. How about, do hymnals actually shape?
That's actually kind of the same as the previous question. So can we?
Okay. All right, so let's see. Were there tract hymn books attached to certain missions like benevolence, anti-slavery, or temperance?
Absolutely. And, this is what you can find. Yeah. And actually tract hymn book is a great way to put it, because some of these things are basically just a single printed sheet. You fold it over, you get about 12 pages. And, missions societies will use these, abolitionist societies on both sides of the Atlantic will have these little teeny things. And other people will put together bigger books to try to make more of essentially a kind of media statement. Abolitionists in particular are really big on putting these songs of the free and hymns of Christian freedom is one that I think along these lines, where it's just packed with dozens of different texts that all speak to either abolition policy or the plight of slaves, or about Christian spirituality as people understand it in that kind of reform context. Like being part of a reform movement helps make you a better Christian in a lot of people's minds, particularly in the first half of the 19th century. So, that's something that, you do see a lot of, and then certain groups will start to put those into their collection. Just one quick example, I had held up this little Methodist book. This is actually from a Methodist splinter group, the Wesleyan Methodist Connection in America. Houghton College in upstate New York is connected with this denomination. And they were a group of upstate New York and New England Methodists who broke off from the national church when the slavery debate was getting huge in the 1840s because they were sick and tired of the denomination not taking an abolitionist stance. The heads of the denomination were desperately trying to keep the whole thing together, and this group said, nope, forget it, we're leaving, and we have three reasons why we're leaving. We don't want slavery, we're pro-temperance, we don't want alcohol being sold, and we don't like bishops. Well, you don't see a whole lot of anti-bishop hymns, but there is a section of temperance hymns and a section of abolitionist hymns in their denominational book because that was their identity. A lot of denominations thought that was too much of a hot button issue to put into their denominational book, but for that particular group, which again was self-consciously a fringe group in the 19th century, that was what they wanted available, not just so they could sing it, but also to make a statement. Hey, this is who we are. We want this as part of our tradition.
So an additional part of this question is wondering, are traveling preachers using or even selling these texts?
Oh yeah, and in fact, the Methodists are counting on the preachers to basically be their book agents. And there are a lot of statements that you'll see in Methodist books that say, only buy from the book agents, don't buy Methodist books anywhere else. There are, knockoffs and things that people are putting together because the Methodists actually figured out how to not just hold their church together by having shared text, this kind of Benedict Anderson imagined communities kind of that, like everybody has the same book. They figured out how to make money, and a lot of money from this kind of thing, where their publishing was actually making a lot of their income by the time the church split north and south. And there was a lawsuit that actually went all the way to the Supreme Court when the church split that was just over who's going to get to keep the publishing wing as north and south churches split up. And yeah, so the preachers were a huge part of that kind of book trade dimension of how these things moved around.
Thank you. Let's see, Patricia's wondering when interlining text and music fell out of practice prior to the 18th century hymn books in favor of just including words. She's saying that she had a student who was working on a medieval antiphonor and it was interlined. So when did this text-only format come from?
That's a really good question. And this was what I saw a little further down. I think I saw Nim Cook, who's done a lot of work on tune books, weighing in on some of this history as well. But Patty, it's great to hear from you. I miss you. Patty and I have, go way, way back. And it's a typically great question from her. The practice in medieval churches was very much, there's a set number of hymns, and there are new ones that are coming out, but they're not coming out super fast. And they're meant to be sung in this kind of choral setting. So that antiphonor that she refers to, I'm assuming is going to be one of these books that's like, yay, big. It's going to be huge. The notes are going to be written really big. The words are going to be written really big, because you might have as many as a dozen people standing in a group looking at this book together. So they're all going to have to be able to read it. The thing that changes in English Protestantism is that essentially all that hymn singing goes out the window in particularly Elizabeth's reign in the 1500s. And you have psalms that are being sung, and they're being sung a cappella, but hymns are seen as personal expression, not corporate expression, and not divinely inspired expression. That's where the Psalms get the advantage, is it's from the Bible, so God wrote it. And so people will have these collections of hymns in private devotional settings only. And so when we think about people like John Donne, George Herbert, occasionally these might have been used in, say, chapel services in nobles' houses, but they're really meant for private use. And so you package those as books of poetry because that's really what they're getting used as. And then you get people like Isaac Watts, and there are a few before him like John Mason, who try to bring him singing back into the church. But one of the things that they realize is, man, it costs a ton of money to produce printed music. And we're just not going to go there. And so as they try to change the practice, that 16th century, 17th century form of the book as just words remains until well into the 19th century. And there are these separate books that give you the collection of tunes, which is what the choirs will wind up using. But those are expensive enough that you don't have a whole congregation buy those. So that's essentially where a lot of that comes from. So that in some ways, what's going on in the mid-19th century with Beecher and guys like that is trying to recover what was pretty much a standard setup in manuscript culture in, say, the High Middle Ages. And it had just gotten erased, partly for technological reasons and partly for these theological reasons. It was just hymns fell out of favor for a while and then came back as the big new thing to do in the 1700s, where people got into huge fights over, should we have these or not?
Thank you. Nathan's wondering if you can say more about what role the rise of popular ecumenical Protestant hymns had on the decline of Psalter singing, like in the Dutch and French Calvinist traditions in the US in the 19th century. Might this have shifted the ways that the language of individual piety or effective themes replaced a lot of the collective focused language found in the Psalms?
Yeah, I think that going from we to I is really, really big in the history of hymnody. And yeah, I'm glad that you put your finger on that, Nathan. This is, it's all, thinking of what happens to Psalter singing, there are these very Psalms focused traditions that will hang on to this for a very long time. Scottish Presbyterians are one version of this. Yeah, certainly Dutch Calvinists are another. Certain branches of the Presbyterian Church will hang on to Psalms and resist hymns for a very long time. Again, taking up the PCUSA as an example, I think they're a really interesting bellwether in the 19th century because they kind of try to have it both ways. They're one of the churches that insist we still need a Psalter, but we're going to put hymns with that. And probably one of the big things that works against the Psalters continuing is that an advantage that hymnody has going for it is it's new and it's continuing to be new, and people keep writing new stuff. Once hymn writing starts catching on, it doesn't stop. On the flip side, psalm translations or paraphrases really don't draw the talent that they used to. So, thinking it, say, again, 1600s, you can find all kinds of amazing psalm paraphrases that people are doing. Some for worship purposes, some for more just reading purposes. Philip and Mary Sidney being probably famous examples of the latter. But one of the things that starts to happen is, people just start looking around and realizing, wow, there are all kinds of new modern hymns that we like, but all the psalm stuff is old now, and we don't really have anything better to use. And this really hit home for the Presbyterians. They had, before the North-South split, there was an old school, new school split, and the new school just wanted hymns. The old school wanted the Psalter with the hymns, and their committee in the early 1840s was supposed to revise a 10-year-old book that had the Psalms and hymns both in it. And they came back, and the committee had all kinds of recommendations what to do with the hymn section. They felt like they had a really good handle on that. But what they finally wound up saying with the Psalm section is, we tried and we tried and we tried, and actually there is no way to improve the one we had from 10 years ago. And it's not because the one we had 10 years ago was perfect, it's just because there ain't nothing coming out. And so for some church, that was really what it came down to, was that it's not just that, is it about me and my experience, or is it about the Psalms? It came down to language, and that the Psalms sounded stuffy and old as, poetry taste changed and all this kind of thing. And so you could keep sprucing up your hymns and not your Psalms. And that was, the rock on which a lot of those traditions kind of foundered.
So Chris, there are some cases where it's going the other way. So the denomination that I grew up in, which is a small Swedish American denomination that's from a mission and non-Calvin tradition, in its most recent hymnal that came out, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago,
Mhm.
added psalms in the back, and it's the
Yes.
first covenant hymnal to have a psalter in it. So I think it's partly an effort to sort of draw in people who are maybe from other denominational backgrounds who are new to the church.
Right. Yeah. But I think there is a lot of that going on right now. And I'm really glad, yeah, that you mentioned that, Paul, because it does seem that things have swung back a bit. You know, there's so much of this kind of getting back to origins push in so many different corners of Christianity right now. You know, evangelicals rediscovering Catholic practices, and, you know, mainline denominations re-embracing their liturgical background, and then groups like, say, the Covenant Church that you're referring to, which has traditionally not gone high liturgy. That's really starting to see, you know, there's a heritage that hasn't been tapped very well that we can get into, and it does seem that more and more churches, even if they don't have a separate psalm section, they're including more psalm texts in the more recent collections. And that's something I think is even starting to filter a bit into worship music in terms of which texts, you know, the praise songs are being based on. The Psalms are coming back. And the reasons why I think are absolutely fascinating. And this is where, you know, historians of religion could really be, you know, offering us some interesting insight. Why are the Psalms, you know, having a comeback at this moment?
Thank you. Stephen Sheeran is commenting that in musicology, we typically discuss books with tunes, whether with or without text, as tune books. And there are traditions today that refer to them as tune books. And so I see Nim Cook has a little answer about this as well, but I'm curious to see what you have to say.
Yeah, well, if you'll pardon me for just a moment, I'm going to grab something else off a shelf over here. And because, again, I think it's more helpful visually to see this.
I love that you know right where the thing is that you're looking for.
Well, this is, it's controlled chaos in this space. And one of the things I don't want to lose track of is where I put my hymn books and my tune books and all this. So again, you know, the modern hymnal will have this kind of a layout. It's generally a portrait layout, and you know, you get everything stacked together that way. What I'm going to show here is that Lowell Mason hymn book that I showed a little bit earlier, and then one of his tune books that actually people may very well have used. So again, this is the congregational book that he puts out about 1831, and that's a hymn book. And then this tune book that comes out in about 1840 that a lot of people would have used in conjunction with that has this kind of layout. And so this, when Nim is talking about tune books, this is what he's talking about, where the format of it is very horizontal, and it's all about the music, and you get generally only one verse to go with each tune, really just to illustrate this is the way the words would fit the music. And again, what would be happening in a given service is you would have everyone in the congregation have one of these. And by the way, this is the large format one. So a lot of people would have had something smaller than this. Back when, you know, people had to bring their own, the church would usually only buy one of these. And so you could sit with this, this was the church's copy, and they made sure that you knew where it was supposed to go. But then the choir would be holding all these kinds of things. And so that's how they would figure out how to and it was tricky in the choir because generally you had to have both books, and that could get really unwieldy. And there was one not super popular solution, but a really creative one that I also brought today, just because I thought maybe we'll have a chance to do this. This is an edition of Watts's Psalms and Hymns from Exeter, New Hampshire in the 18 teens. And this is what's known as a Dutch door publication. So all the Psalms and hymns are up along the top here, and then you can flip to whatever tune you want. And so this way you can have it all in one volume. So before the hymnal, you know, this guy came along, the Dutch door was a way to jerry rig what people eventually wanted the hymnal to do. So hopefully that helps the difference between, you know, what a hymnal is, a hymn book is, and a tune book is. Because yeah, the hymnal is basically a newish way of trying to mash up the tune book and the hymn book.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, that is what those books were called during their contemporary times.
Yes.
So, okay. Well, we are, we still have a lot of questions, but it's already 11:23.
Right.
Skimming through, are there any others that you really want to answer live? Otherwise, we can try to answer some offline maybe.
Yeah. So I get the, well, I know that Dan Ritchie's question, he had actually sent in a bit earlier, and I was thinking about this last night, and I see Frank Felsenstein's question below that about hymns and the Book of Common Prayer, and I might just mash those two up really quick as one to finish on. So is it okay if I summarize the questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So Dan's question is about the only hymns. I had referred to this before, that John Newton put out his own collection of hymns, and one of his congregants, William Cowper, who became a very, very famous poet as well as a very famous writer of hymns, collaborated with him on this. Newton's parish was called Olney, and so the collection Olney Hymns was to indicate these are for his parish, but of course these got used all around the world eventually. This particular set of hymns, what Daniel is asking about is, were these actually sung in Newton's church? And there's some sort of, you know, some question about exactly how this got used. So, and then this other question is about what relation do hymns have with the Book of Common Prayer, which again is the standard Church of England / Anglican / Episcopalian worship book that eventually will include hymns, but is really held in kind of contrast to hymns for a long time. So the Book of Common Prayer, or BCP, is what would have been standard in Newton's parish. But part of the problem was that this was a very poor parish. The literacy rates were relatively low, and people also didn't have a lot of, book ownership was also quite low because people didn't have the income for books. And so not everybody necessarily had a BCP. Even though that was kind of expected in the Church of England. And so what Newton wound up doing was, rather than producing this for the services, because, you know, he's an Anglican priest who's got his bishop he has to keep happy. And so, you know, most of the bishops at that point do not sing hymns. That's what Methodists do. And we don't want to be Methodists. Methodists are bad. So, you know, only sing psalms. That was what, you know, was sanctioned in the church. But then he would have these weeknight prayer services. And these were hosted at what was called the Great House, basically the Lord's Mansion, who was in charge of that parish. And so it was held outside the church building in this kind of private chapel area, and people would come from all over the parish to these things. And Newton would preach, there would be prayers, and then he would write these hymns in order to illustrate the sermons and basically serve as a way of remembering what the point of the sermons was. So that, you know, when the Dutch Reformed people pick up Newton and they say, hey, this illustrates lots of points of theology, there's a reason for that, because that's exactly what Newton thought he was doing, was illustrating these different points that he's trying to convey to his congregation. And he would have these, what's called lined out. This is what Patty referred to in a previous question. Before everybody has their own book, you would have this practice where somebody in the front of the church would read or sing out a line, and the congregation would sing it back, and then the next line, and then back. As you imagine, it takes forever, but it also means that everybody can experience the text, whether or not they can read, and whether or not they have a book handy. And so this lining out was the first way that people would have sung Newton's hymns, like Amazing Grace, or Cowper's hymns. And it was meant to be memorized so that people could take it away in their heads and kind of in their ears as they go back to their work week. That was really what it was about. And so when he puts the book together, the book isn't really for his congregation. He actually says that this is a monument to my friendship with William Cooper. That Newton was a really famous guy by this point. His autobiography about how he'd been a slaver and had a conversion and all that was a bestseller. And so he knew how to get a book published. And he just wanted this published as a testimony to, hey, I thought it was really cool that this guy in my congregation and I were writing these hymns together. And from there, people didn't use that in their own churches. It was these editors of later books that started to pull those things out and say, hey, Amazing Grace would be great over here. And Glorious Things of the Ear Spoken would be great over here. And sometimes The Light Surprises would be great over here. So that the book became more of a mine for future congregations rather than something that a congregation itself could actually use. And so connecting that with the Book of Common Prayer, those kinds of local connections, like, okay, I know my bishop isn't super happy about this, but there are a few things that I know people would like, especially because this became a kind of let's compete with the Methodists thing. If you were in an area where the Methodists were starting to poach a lot of folks away from your Church of England parish, adding in some hymns on the sly could be a way of kind of countering that that particular threat that you see in your community. And so you would have these little, again, sometimes single sheet local collections that might be single parish, or maybe 2 or 3 parishes get together and put something together, and they'll tack that onto the back of their Book of Common Prayer. And it's only, again, much later on that the hymn supplement becomes standard and accepted as part of how a Book of Common Prayer is produced.
Thank you. All right. Well, we're already at 11:30.
Yeah, I'm happy to hang around and work through more questions if people want to stick around for the answers. But yeah, I also don't want to hold up anyone unnecessarily.
We do still have over 90 people signed into the session. So if you want to keep answering
Bless
questions,
you all.
it seems like people are interested. So I just wanted to be cognizant of your time as well.
But Angela, I know a couple people have asked about this. We do have a way of answering questions that have been asked after the session ends, and then people can see the answers when they watch the recording.
So we do have a way to follow up with people directly
Okay.
if we don't get to their question.
But not a way for everybody to see the answers, or?
It won't be part of the recording.
Okay.
All right.
So however you want to handle this, Angela, is good with me.
Yep.
Well, there seems to be a couple of questions relating to the children's versions of hymns.
Yeah.
Maybe we could cover that.
Yeah, so let's see. I see Jacqueline Reed Walsh's, could you elaborate on children's versions of hymns? And then Cheryl Thurber's Sunday school hymnals seem to regularly include me, which is, very true. I think that's a good point. Yeah, Cheryl adds on, these tend to come from commercial presses, not the societies, which again, this is how Lowell Mason is working things, that Lowell Mason is really a businessman. He's very concerned about, improving worship quality and all this kind of thing, but he's not working for a church. He's not working for a denomination. He's really about making money from all of this. And so, yeah, there are a lot of these commercial hymn producer because again, like with the Watts Divine Songs thing, just these sell. People will buy all kinds of these, and especially if it's for kids, because it's seen as a way of teaching them Christianity in a way that is more fun than a catechism or, a collection of sermons or something like that. And particularly for what would be called infant schools, nursery schools, these early Sunday schools and Sabbath schools, singing was a way to teach recitation. And a lot of those very early schools were really about teaching reading skills. And so whatever you could do to encourage literacy in children was a boon, was a good way to go. Coming out of that was the sense that, well, one of the ways to keep kids engaged is to keep them singing because kids love singing. And the funny thing is, once people like Beecher and the Andover committee and these other folks start to put together these the first hymnals, and they're getting pushback from the grown-ups, the people in those churches who already know how to sing are the Sunday school kids, because they learned it in Sunday school. And so there are actually accounts of some of these churches, and I think Beecher might have actually done this, planting Sunday school kids around the sanctuary as ringers, so that the adults can hear the kids carrying the tune and kind of stumble along with them. And after doing that for, say, 5-10 years, those kids have now become young adults. They're in the choirs, they're sitting in their family pews helping with the singing and all that. And so by the time, again, that's all happening 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s is that moment where the pastors start to figure, hey, we could actually work with this, we could actually do something with this. And so that's why you see the congregational swing happening when you do, is partly because of what had already been happening in the Sunday schools. And this is one of the things I found in my study, is that both in terms of the use of music, but also in terms of how you're willing to import things from other traditions. Or I also saw that Hal asked a question about poems poets writing hymns. In kids' collections, they don't worry about that. Like, is this really a hymn? It's kind of hymnish, and kids will like singing it, so we're going to put it in the collection. Whereas for a denominational collection, it's like, well, is it doctrinally sound? Is it the right sensibility? All this kind of thing. That's not nearly as much an issue for the kids, and so the ecumenical shift happens earlier for the kids. The literary shift, where poems can work as hymns, happen earlier for the kids, and then the music happens earlier for the kids. So in some ways, children's hymnody is actually the vanguard of where hymns go in the 19th century, which is something I did not expect to find with this study, and was really, really interesting. So yeah, hopefully that gets to those questions.
That's very cool. Thank you so much. Well, I think we'll send you the questions that we haven't answered yet, because I feel like we hit upon little bits and pieces of them in some of the other answers. But thank you so much for being here with us today. This has been
thank you.
amazing.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Great to see you.
Yeah,
you as well. And yeah, what great questions.
definitely. And thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a great weekend.
Right.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.